What does it take to transform a weak, divided nation into the greatest military power the ancient world had ever seen? How does a young prince held captive in a foreign land return home to build an empire? And why do we remember his son Alexander as the Great, while often forgetting the father who made everything possible? Macedonia was a land of proud nobles, fierce soldiers, and ancient traditions stretching back generations. This is the story of Philip II of Macedon. The childhood of Philip remains somewhat mysterious to us across the vast distance of time. Ancient sources tell us relatively little about his earliest years, focusing instead on the dramatic events of his later life. But we can piece together a picture of what his youth must have been like based on what we know about Macedonian royal culture and the specific circumstances of his family. As the youngest son of King Amyntas, Philip would have received the education expected of a Macedonian prince. This meant training in the arts of war from the earliest possible age. Macedonian nobles learned to ride almost before they could walk, and Philip would have been no exception. The bond between a Macedonian warrior and his horse was considered sacred, a relationship that could mean the difference between life and death on the battlefield. Young Philip would have learned to handle weapons as soon as he was strong enough to lift them. The spear, the sword, the javelin, these were the tools of his trade, and mastering them was essential for any prince who hoped to command the respect of his future subjects. Macedonian nobles judged their leaders by their personal courage and martial skill. A king who could not fight was a king who would not last long. But Philip's education went beyond mere military training. The Macedonian court, despite its reputation for barbarism among southern Greeks, was actually quite sophisticated in its cultural aspirations. Amyntas and his predecessors had invited Greek artists, poets, and philosophers to Pella. The great playwright Euripides had spent his final years at the Macedonian court, and his influence lingered long after his death. Philip would have been exposed to Greek literature, music, and ideas from an early age. This dual education, combining the warrior traditions of Macedonia with the intellectual culture of Greece, would prove crucial to Philip's later success. He would become a man equally comfortable leading a cavalry charge and negotiating a complex diplomatic agreement. He understood both the raw power of military force and the subtle arts of persuasion and manipulation. Philip's family life was complicated even by the standards of Macedonian royalty. His mother Eurydice was a formidable woman who would play an active role in the political intrigues of the court for decades. His older brothers, Alexander and Perdiccas, stood between him and the throne, and the relationships between siblings in royal families were often marked by suspicion and rivalry. Yet Philip seems to have maintained good relations with his brothers, perhaps because his position, as the youngest, made him less of an immediate threat. The death of King Amyntas, around 370 before the Common Era, threw the kingdom into turmoil. Philip was still a young boy, perhaps 12 years old, when his father died, and his oldest brother Alexander took the throne as Alexander II. The new king faced immediate challenges from all directions. The Illyrians threatened from the west. Rival claimants to the throne emerged from various branches of the royal family, and the great powers of Greece saw an opportunity to meddle in Macedonian affairs. It was during this period of chaos that Philip's life took a dramatic turn. Thebes, the most powerful city-state in Greece at that time, had intervened in Macedonian affairs to support Alexander II against his enemies. As part of the diplomatic arrangements that followed, young Philip was sent to Thebes as a hostage. This was common practice in the ancient world, a way of guaranteeing that agreements would be honoured. The Macedonian royal family was essentially giving Thebes a valuable insurance policy. Being a hostage did not necessarily mean being a prisoner in chains. Philip was treated as a guest of honour, housed in the home of a prominent Theban citizen, and given access to the best that Theban society had to offer. but he was also a captive, unable to leave, his fate dependent on the continued good relations between Thebes and Macedonia. If those relations soured, Philip's life could be forfeit. The Thebes that Philip encountered was at the height of its power and glory. Under the leadership of two brilliant generals, Epaminondas and Pelopidas, the Thebans had shattered the myth of Spartan invincibility at the Battle of Leuctra in 371. This stunning victory had transformed the balance of power in Greece, ending Spartan dominance and establishing Thebes as the leading military power in the Greek world. For a young man interested in the arts of war, there could hardly have been a better place to receive an education. Philip had the opportunity to observe the Theban military system at close range, to study the innovations that had made their army so formidable, and to learn from the greatest generals of the age. This was not formal instruction in any classroom sense, but rather the kind of learning that comes from being immersed in a particular environment and paying close attention to everything around you. The Theban military revolution centered on several key innovations that Philip would later adapt and improve upon. The most famous was the oblique order of battle developed by Epaminondas. Traditional Greek warfare involved two armies of heavily armoured infantry called hoplites crashing into each other in a straightforward collision. The stronger side usually won through sheer weight of numbers and the courage of its soldiers. Epaminondas changed this equation by concentrating his strength on one wing of his army while refusing combat on the other. At Leuctra, he massed his best troops, including the legendary sacred band on his left wing, and drove them forward in a deep column that smashed through the Spartan right. By the time the Spartans realized what was happening, their king was dead and their army was broken. This tactical innovation demonstrated that brains could triumph over brawn, that a smaller army could defeat a larger one through superior generalship. Philip absorbed these lessons eagerly. He watched how the Thebans trained their soldiers, how they organized their units, how they coordinated infantry and cavalry on the battlefield. He saw the sacred band in action, a force of 300 elite warriors bound together by bonds of love and loyalty, fighting with a ferocity that made them virtually invincible. He noted how the Thebans used light troops and cavalry to screen their movements and harass their enemies. But Philip's education in Thebes went beyond purely military matters. He also learned about Greek politics, about the complex web of alliances and rivalries that connected the various city-states. He saw how Thebes managed its hegemony over the other Greek states, using a combination of military force and diplomatic pressure to maintain its position. He observed the weaknesses as well as the strengths of the Greek political system, the constant feuding between cities, the inability to maintain unity in the face of common threats. The household where Philip lived belonged to Pamenes, a prominent Theban general and politician. This gave Philip access to the highest levels of Theban society and allowed him to form connections that would prove valuable in later years. He learned to speak Greek with the polish of an educated southerner, erasing the rough edges of his Macedonian accent. He absorbed Greek culture, Greek philosophy, and Greek ways of thinking. Some ancient sources suggest that Philip formed a particularly close relationship with Epaminondas himself, though the details remain unclear. Whether or not they had direct personal contact, Philip certainly studied Epaminondas's methods carefully. The great Theban general became a model that Philip would later surpass, taking the innovations of Leuctra and developing them into something even more formidable. The years in Thebes also taught Philip about the darker side of Greek politics. He saw how the city-states constantly schemed against each other, how today's ally could become tomorrow's enemy, how no agreement was truly binding if circumstances changed. He learned that Greeks could be bribed, flattered, and manipulated, that their famous love of freedom often masked petty jealousies and short-sighted ambitions. These insights would serve him well when he later set out to conquer the Greek world. Philip remained in Thebes for approximately 3 years, from around 368 to 365 before the Common Era. During this time, the situation in Macedonia continued to deteriorate. His brother Alexander II was assassinated, and another brother, Perdiccas the Third, took the throne. The kingdom lurched from crisis to crisis, battered by foreign enemies and torn by internal strife. When Philip finally returned to Macedonia, he was no longer the young boy who'd been sent away as a hostage. He was a young man of perhaps 17, educated in the most advanced military techniques of the age, experienced in the ways of Greek politics, and burning with ambition. He had seen what a well-organized state could accomplish, and he had ideas about how to transform his backward kingdom into something far greater. The return to Macedonia must have been a shock after the sophistication of Thebes. Pella was a provincial town compared to the great Greek cities, and the Macedonian court, for all its pretensions, could not match the cultural richness of Theban society. But Philip was not discouraged. He saw the raw potential of his homeland, the fierce warriors, the abundant resources, the strategic position. What Macedonia lacked was organization, unity, and visionary leadership. Philip intended to provide all three. For the moment, however, he was merely a younger brother of the king, with no official position and no guarantee of ever reaching the throne. Perdiccas the Third was young and healthy, and there was every reason to expect that he would reign for decades and pass the crown to his own sons. Philip would have to wait, to watch, and to prepare himself for opportunities that might never come. But fate had other plans. The years following Philip's return from Thebes would bring catastrophe to Macedonia, a disaster so complete that it threatened the very survival of the kingdom. And from that catastrophe, Philip would emerge as the unlikely saviour of his people, the man who would not only restore Macedonia, but raise it to heights undreamed of by any of his predecessors. The nobility of the lowlands was divided into factions, each with its own candidate for power and its own vision of Macedonia's future. Holding this fractious coalition together required constant effort and frequent compromises. Philip watched all of this from his position on the margins of power. He was given some military responsibilities, commanding forces in minor campaigns, but he was not yet a major player in the kingdom's affairs. This period of relative obscurity allowed him to observe, to plan, and to build relationships with men who would later become his most trusted supporters. The sources suggest that Philip used these years wisely. He studied the Macedonian military system, identifying its weaknesses and thinking about how to address them. He cultivated friendships among the younger nobles, men who shared his frustration with the current state of affairs and his dreams of a greater Macedonia. He also kept in touch with his contacts in the Greek world, maintaining the connections he had formed during his years in Thebes. The catastrophe that would change everything came in 359 before the Common Era. King Perdiccas led the Macedonian army against the Illyrians in a major campaign, hoping to finally crush the threat that had plagued his kingdom for so long. The two armies met somewhere in the western highlands, in terrain that favoured the Illyrians and their style of warfare. The battle was a disaster for Macedonia. The Illyrians overwhelmed the Macedonian forces, killing Perdiccas himself, along with 4,000 of his soldiers. This was not just a defeat, but a catastrophe of the first order. The king was dead, the army was shattered, and the kingdom lay open to invasion. Bardilis and his Illyrians could march into the Macedonian heartland virtually unopposed. The news of the disaster spread quickly, and Macedonia's enemies moved to take advantage. The Paeonians launched major raids from the north. The Thracians stirred on the eastern frontier. Various pretenders to the throne emerged from the woodwork, each backed by different foreign powers hoping to install a puppet king. Athens supported one claimant, while other Greek states backed others. The kingdom seemed on the verge of complete dissolution. In this moment of supreme crisis, the Macedonian nobles turned to Philip. Perdiccas had left a young son, Amyntas, who was the legitimate heir to the throne. But a child king was the last thing Macedonia needed in its current desperate situation. The kingdom required a strong leader who could rally the army, repel the invaders, and restore order. Philip was the obvious choice, the only adult male of the royal house with the ability and the ambition to save the situation. The exact nature of Philip's assumption of power remains somewhat unclear in our sources. Some ancient writers say he became king immediately, while others suggest he initially served as regent for his young nephew. The distinction may not have mattered much in practice. What mattered was that Philip now held real power and could begin implementing his plans for Macedonia's salvation. The challenges facing the new ruler were enormous. The army had been destroyed, with thousands of trained soldiers dead on the battlefield. The treasury was empty, drained by years of unsuccessful warfare. The borders were collapsing, with enemies advancing from multiple directions. The nobility was divided, with some supporting Philip, while others backed rival claimants. And hovering over everything was the threat of the Illyrians, who could launch a final invasion at any moment and extinguish the Argead dynasty forever. A lesser man might have despaired. Philip did not. He had spent years preparing for this moment, even if he had not known exactly when or how it would come. He had studied military science in Thebes, he had observed the weaknesses of the Macedonian system, and he had thought long and hard about how to address them. Now, he would put his ideas into practice, transforming Macedonia from a backward kingdom into the greatest military power the Greek world had ever seen. But first he had to survive the immediate crisis. The Illyrians were still out there, flushed with victory and hungry for more. The pretenders were gathering their forces, preparing to challenge Philip's rule. The Paeonians and Thracians were probing the borders, testing for weakness. Philip had to deal with all of these threats simultaneously, with limited resources and uncertain support. His first moves were diplomatic rather than military. Philip understood that he could not fight everyone at once. He needed to buy time, to neutralize some threats while he dealt with others. This required a combination of bribery, promises, and strategic deception that would become hallmarks of his later career. The Thracian king had supported one of the pretenders to the Macedonian throne. Philip sent envoys with generous gifts and honeyed words, persuading the Thracians to withdraw their support. The pretender, deprived of his foreign backing, was quickly eliminated. Philip was ruthless in dealing with rivals, understanding that mercy toward enemies could be fatal in the brutal world of Macedonian politics. The Paeonians were handled differently. Their king had died around the same time as Perdiccas, and the succession was disputed. Philip exploited this confusion, playing different factions against each other and preventing the Paeonians from launching a coordinated invasion. He also sent bribes to key Paeonian leaders, buying their neutrality if not their friendship. Athens posed a more complex problem. The Athenians had supported another pretender, a man named Argeus, who had actually ruled Macedonia briefly years earlier, before being overthrown. Argeus landed on the Macedonian coast with Athenian support, hoping to rally discontented nobles to his cause. This was a direct challenge to Philip's authority that could not be ignored. Philip's response demonstrated the military genius that would later conquer Greece. He moved quickly, catching Argeus before he could gather significant support. The pretender and his followers were defeated in a sharp engagement, with many of the Athenian soldiers captured. But instead of executing his prisoners, or holding them for ransom, Philip released them without conditions and sent them home with expressions of goodwill toward Athens. This gesture of magnanimity was calculated to achieve a specific purpose. Philip needed peace with Athens, at least temporarily, so that he could focus on his other enemies. By treating the Athenian prisoners generously, he signalled that he was not seeking conflict with the great naval power. The Athenians, surprised and somewhat embarrassed by their failed intervention, were willing to make peace. Philip had eliminated one threat and gained valuable time, but the Illyrians remained. Bardalus and his warriors were the greatest danger facing Macedonia, and they could not be bought off or deceived. They had to be defeated in battle, and Philip's shattered army was in no condition to face them. The young king needed time to rebuild his forces and implement the military reforms he had been planning for years. Philip negotiated with Bardalus, seeking a temporary peace that would give him the breathing room he needed. The terms were humiliating. Macedonia had to cede territory to the Illyrians and possibly pay tribute. Some sources suggest that Philip even agreed to marry one of Bardalus's daughters, though this may have come later. Whatever the exact terms, Philip swallowed his pride and accepted them. He understood that a temporary humiliation was preferable to total destruction. With the immediate threats neutralized or at least reduced, Philip could turn to the task of rebuilding Macedonia. The next few years would see a transformation so complete that it would change the course of history. Philip would take the raw material of Macedonian manpower and forge it into the most formidable military machine the ancient world had ever seen. The Macedonia that Philip returned to was a kingdom fighting for its survival. His brother Perdiccas the Third faced threats from every direction, and the resources available to meet those threats were woefully inadequate. The years between Philip's return from Thebes and his own rise to power were marked by constant warfare, desperate diplomacy, and mounting losses. The Illyrians remained the most dangerous enemy. These fierce mountain warriors had been raiding Macedonian territory for generations, but under their king Bardalus, they had become more organised and more ambitious than ever before. Bardalus was an extraordinary figure, a man who had risen from humble origins to unite the Illyrian tribes into a powerful confederation. He was old by the time Philip returned to Macedonia, but his military skills remained sharp and his appetite for conquest undiminished. Perdiccas tried to deal with the Illyrian threat through a combination of warfare and diplomacy. He fought several campaigns against Bardalus with mixed results. The Macedonian army was brave enough, but it lacked the organisation and discipline needed to defeat the Illyrians consistently. The highland terrain favoured the defenders, and the Illyrians knew every path and passed through their mountains. Meanwhile, other enemies pressed in from different directions. The Paeonians to the north sensed Macedonian weakness and increased their raids. The Thracians to the east were always looking for opportunities to expand at Macedonian expense, and the Greeks to the south continued to meddle in Macedonian affairs, supporting various pretenders to the throne and generally making life difficult for whoever happened to be king. The internal situation was equally troubled. The highland lords in the western regions maintained their semi-independence, paying lip service to the Argead kings while pursuing their own interests. The first months of Philip's rule were a masterclass in political survival. He had neutralized the immediate external threats through diplomacy and bribery, but his hold on power remained precarious. The Macedonian nobility was watching him closely, ready to abandon him at the first sign of weakness. The pretenders had been defeated but not eliminated, and new challengers could emerge at any moment. Philip needed to consolidate his position quickly and decisively. His approach combined traditional Macedonian methods with innovations learned during his years in Thebes. He understood that Macedonian kings ruled through personal relationships, through the bonds of loyalty that connected them to their noble companions. Philip set about cultivating these relationships with an energy and skill that his predecessors had lacked. The companions were the heart of the Macedonian military and political system. These noble warriors formed the king's inner circle, his advisors, his generals, and his friends. They fought beside him in battle, hunted with him in peacetime, and feasted with him in the great hall. Their loyalty was essential for any king who hoped to rule effectively. Philip expanded the companions significantly, bringing in talented men from outside the traditional noble families. He recruited Greeks from the south, adventurers seeking their fortune, and capable individuals who might otherwise have been excluded from the highest circles. This policy served multiple purposes. It gave Philip a broader base of support, less dependent on the old noble families with their ancient feuds and rivalries. It brought fresh talent and new ideas into the Macedonian system, and it created a group of men who owed their positions entirely to Philip and were therefore intensely loyal to him personally. The king was generous with gifts and honours, understanding that loyalty had to be rewarded. Land grants, prestigious commands, advantageous marriages, these were the currencies of Macedonian politics, and Philip distributed them freely to those who served him well. He also showed himself willing to overlook past offences. Men who had supported his rivals found that they could earn Philip's favour through loyal service. This policy of reconciliation helped heal the divisions that had weakened Macedonia for so long. But Philip could also be ruthless when necessary. Those who continued to oppose him, who plotted against his rule, or supported foreign-backed pretenders, were dealt with harshly. The sources mention several executions in the early years of Philip's reign, though the details are often unclear. The message was unmistakable. Philip would reward loyalty generously, but he would punish treachery without mercy. The young king also worked to strengthen his legitimacy through religious and cultural means. He emphasized his descent from Heracles, the divine hero whose blood ran in the veins of the Argead dynasty. He patronized the great religious sanctuaries of Macedonia, making generous offerings and hosting elaborate festivals. He presented himself as the champion of Macedonian traditions and values, even as he worked to transform those traditions into something new. Philip's relationship with his nephew Amyntas, the son of Perdiccas, illustrates his political sophistication. The boy had the strongest claim to the throne by hereditary right, and some Macedonians undoubtedly felt that Philip was a usurper. Rather than eliminating this potential rival, Philip kept Amyntas at court, treated him with honour, and eventually married him to one of his own daughters. This approach neutralised the threat while maintaining the appearance of family unity. The king's personal qualities played a crucial role in his success. Philip was charismatic, able to inspire loyalty and affection in those around him. He was also approachable, willing to listen to advice and to admit when he was wrong. Ancient sources describe him as witty and good-humoured, able to diffuse tense situations with a well-timed joke. These qualities made him popular with both nobles and common soldiers. At the same time, Philip was a man of enormous physical courage. He led his troops from the front, sharing their dangers and hardships. Over the course of his career, he would suffer numerous wounds, losing an eye, breaking a collarbone, and being maimed in the leg. These injuries, far from diminishing his authority, actually enhanced it. They showed that the king was willing to pay the same price as his soldiers, that he would not ask them to face dangers he was not willing to face himself. Philip's court became a centre of culture and learning, as well as military power. He invited Greek intellectuals to Pella, continuing the tradition established by his predecessors, but with greater energy and resources. The most famous of these invitations would come later, when Philip hired the philosopher Aristotle to tutor his son Alexander. But from the beginning of his reign, Philip sought to present Macedonia as a civilized kingdom worthy of respect. The king also reformed the administration of his realm, though the details are frustratingly vague in our sources. He seems to have created new positions and offices, bringing greater efficiency to the collection of taxes and the management of resources. He developed the gold and silver mines of Macedonia, particularly those in the region of Mount Pangaeum, which would later provide the wealth needed to fund his military campaigns. All of these political and administrative reforms were important, but they were ultimately in service of Philip's primary goal, the creation of a military force capable of defeating Macedonia's enemies and establishing the kingdom as a major power. The army that Philip inherited was brave but disorganized, capable of occasional victories but prone to catastrophic defeats. Philip would transform it into something entirely new, a professional fighting force that combined the best elements of Macedonian tradition with the latest innovations in Greek warfare. The transformation began almost immediately after Philip secured his position. He gathered the survivors of the disaster against the Illyrians, along with new recruits from across Macedonia, and began the intensive training that would become a hallmark of his military system. The soldiers drilled constantly, learning to move in formation, to respond to commands, and to maintain discipline under pressure. Philip understood that the key to military success was not just individual courage, but collective organization. A Macedonian warrior might be as brave as any man alive, but bravery alone could not defeat a well-organized enemy. The soldiers needed to function as a unit, each man trusting that his comrades would do their part. This required training, discipline, and a sense of shared identity that transcended individual or regional loyalties. The king also addressed the equipment of his soldiers. The traditional Macedonian infantryman was lightly armed compared to the heavily armoured hoplites of the Greek city-states. This had certain advantages in terms of mobility and cost, but it left the Macedonians vulnerable when facing disciplined heavy infantry. Philip needed to find a balance, creating soldiers who could stand against Greek hoplites while retaining the flexibility that Macedonian warfare demanded. The solution he developed was the sarissa, a pike of extraordinary length that would revolutionize ancient warfare. We will explore this innovation in detail shortly, for it deserves careful attention. But first, let us understand the broader context of Philip's military reforms and how they fit into his vision for Macedonia's future. Philip recognized that his kingdom possessed certain natural advantages that had never been properly exploited. Macedonia had a large population compared to the individual Greek city-states, providing a deep pool of potential soldiers. The Macedonian highlands produced excellent horsemen, men who had ridden since childhood and who formed natural cavalry. The kingdom's central position allowed it to strike in multiple directions, threatening enemies who could not easily coordinate their responses. What Macedonia lacked was the wealth and organization to translate these advantages into sustained military power. The Greek city-states, despite their smaller populations, could field professional armies because their economies were more developed and their political systems more efficient. Philip set out to close this gap, building the economic and administrative foundations that would support his military ambitions. The gold and silver mines of Mount Pangaeum became crucial to this effort. These mines, located in the region east of Macedonia proper, had been exploited for centuries, but never with the intensity that Philip would bring to them. He expanded mining operations dramatically, bringing in skilled workers and investing in new techniques. The wealth that flowed from these mines would fund Philip's armies, bribe his enemies, and finance his diplomatic initiatives. Philip also reformed the system of land tenure in Macedonia, granting estates to his supporters and creating a class of military settlers who owed their prosperity to the king. These men formed a reliable core of soldiers, available for service whenever Philip called upon them. The system created bonds of mutual obligation that strengthened the connection between king and army. The training regimen that Philip imposed on his soldiers was unprecedented in its intensity. The men drilled constantly, marching long distances with full equipment, practicing formations, and learning to respond instantly to commands. Philip himself often participated in these exercises, demonstrating that the king was not above the hardships he imposed on his men. This training served multiple purposes beyond simple military preparation. It broke down the regional identities that had divided Macedonia for so long, forging soldiers from different areas into a unified force. A man from the highlands and a man from the coastal plains might have little in common initially, but after months of training and marching together, they developed bonds of comradeship that transcended their origins. Philip also instituted regular pay for his soldiers, transforming them from a seasonal militia into something approaching a professional army. This was expensive, requiring the wealth from the mines and other sources, but it gave Philip a force that was available year-round rather than only during the traditional campaigning season. He could launch campaigns in winter when his enemies expected rest, or maintain pressure on multiple fronts simultaneously. The officer corps received particular attention. Philip promoted men based on ability rather than birth alone, though noble origins certainly helped. He created a system where talented individuals could rise through the ranks, earning commands through demonstrated competence. This meritocratic element attracted ambitious men from across the Greek world, adding their skills to the Macedonian military machine. By the end of his first year in power, Philip had stabilized the kingdom and begun the military reforms that would transform it. The immediate threats had been neutralized through diplomacy. The internal opposition had been crushed or co-opted, and the foundations of a new army were being laid. But the real test was still to come. The Illyrians remained undefeated, their power unbroken, their appetites for Macedonian territory unsatisfied. Philip knew that he could not remain on the defensive forever. The peace he had purchased from Bardalis was temporary, a breathing space rather than a permanent solution. Sooner or later, he would have to face the Illyrians in battle and defeat them decisively. Everything he was building pointed toward that confrontation. The army that Philip created was unlike anything the ancient world had seen before. It combined elements from various military traditions, Macedonian, Greek, Thracian, and others, into a unified system of extraordinary effectiveness. Understanding this army is essential for understanding Philip's achievements, for it was the instrument through which he conquered his enemies and transformed the political landscape of the ancient world. At the heart of Philip's military revolution was the sarissa, the great pike that became the signature weapon of Macedonian infantry. This was not simply a longer spear, but a fundamentally different weapon that required new tactics, new training, and new ways of thinking about warfare. The sarissa measured somewhere between 15 and 18 feet in length, roughly twice as long as the spears carried by Greek hoplites. It was made from cornel wood, chosen for its combination of strength and flexibility, and tipped with an iron point. A metal butt spike at the other end served as a counterweight and could be used as a secondary weapon if the main point broke. Wielding such a weapon required both hands, which meant that the soldiers carrying sarissas could not use the large round shields that protected Greek hoplites. Instead, they carried smaller shields strapped to their forearms, leaving their hands free to manage the unwieldy pike. This trade-off, less protection for greater reach, was central to the Macedonian tactical system. The sarissa was not a weapon for individual combat. It was too long and too awkward for a soldier to use effectively on his own. Its power came from massed formation, from ranks of men presenting a forest of pike points to the enemy. When a phalanx of sarissa-armed infantry advanced, the first 5 ranks could project their weapons, beyond the front line, creating a hedge of iron points that was virtually impossible to penetrate. Imagine facing such a formation. You are a Greek hoplite, armed with a spear perhaps 8 feet long and protected by a heavy bronze shield. You advance toward the Macedonian line, and before you can get close enough to use your weapon, you encounter pike point after pike point, each one seeking your flesh. You cannot reach the men holding those pikes because their weapons are so much longer than yours. You cannot easily deflect the points because there are so many of them, coming from multiple ranks simultaneously. This was the nightmare that Philip's enemies faced, and it explains why the Macedonian phalanx was so successful. The sarissa gave Philip's infantry a decisive advantage in frontal combat against traditional Greek hoplites. But the weapon had limitations that Philip understood and compensated for. The sarissa phalanx was vulnerable on its flanks and rear. The soldiers could not easily turn to face threats from unexpected directions, and if the formation was broken, the long pikes became liabilities rather than assets. The phalanx also required flat, open terrain to function effectively. Rough ground could disorder the formation, creating gaps that an aggressive enemy could exploit. Philip addressed these vulnerabilities through combined arms tactics, coordinating his phalanx with cavalry, light infantry, and other troop types to create a flexible fighting force. The phalanx was the anvil, the solid mass that fixed the enemy in place and absorbed their attacks. The cavalry was the hammer, the mobile strike force that delivered the decisive blow. The Macedonian cavalry, known as the companion cavalry, was the finest mounted force in the Greek world. These were noble warriors, the sons of Macedonia's leading families, mounted on the best horses and equipped with the finest weapons. They had been the elite of the Macedonian army for generations, but Philip transformed them from a collection of individual champions into a disciplined tactical unit. The companions were organised into squadrons called elae, each commanded by an experienced officer and trained to execute complex manoeuvres on the battlefield. They learned to charge in wedge formation, a triangular arrangement that concentrated their impact at a single point and allowed them to penetrate enemy formations. They practiced wheeling, reforming, and charging again, developing the ability to deliver multiple attacks in a single engagement. Philip typically commanded the companion cavalry personally, leading them in the decisive charge that would break the enemy line. This was extraordinarily dangerous, as the king exposed himself to the same risks as his men, but it was also extraordinarily effective. The sight of the king himself leading the charge inspired the cavalry to feats of courage, while demoralizing enemies who saw the Macedonian ruler bearing down on them with lance levelled. The relationship between phalanx and cavalry was the key to Macedonian tactical success. The phalanx would advance against the enemy centre, engaging their attention and preventing them from manoeuvring freely. Meanwhile, the cavalry would seek an opening, usually on one of the flanks, where they could charge into the enemy formation and create chaos. Once the cavalry had broken through, the battle typically became a rout, with the Macedonians pursuing and cutting down their fleeing enemies. This tactical system was not entirely original to Philip. Elements of it can be seen in the Theban methods he had studied during his years as a hostage, and earlier commanders had experimented with combined arms tactics. But Philip refined and perfected the system, training his army to execute it with a precision that his predecessors had never achieved. Beyond the phalanx and the companion cavalry, Philip's army included numerous other troop types that added flexibility and capability. The hypaspists were elite infantry who could fight either as heavy troops in the phalanx or as more mobile soldiers for special missions. Their name means shield bearers, and they served as a link between the heavy infantry and the cavalry, able to keep pace with mounted troops when necessary. Light infantry played important roles in Philip's campaigns. Javelin throwers, slingers, and archers provided missile fire that could disrupt enemy formations before the main engagement. Peltasts, named for the light shields they carried, were mobile skirmishers who could harass the enemy, screen the army's movements, and pursue fleeing opponents. Philip recruited many of these light troops from the mountain tribes of the Balkans, men who had spent their lives fighting in rough terrain, and who brought valuable skills to the Macedonian army. Philip also developed sophisticated siege capabilities, an area where the Greek city-states had traditionally excelled. He hired engineers from Syracuse, the leading centre of siege warfare technology, and set them to work designing new machines. Catapults that could hurl stones or bolts with devastating force, siege towers that could overtop city walls, battering rams protected by armoured housings. These and other devices gave Philip the ability to capture fortified cities that might otherwise have held out indefinitely. The importance of siege warfare cannot be overstated. In the ancient world, cities were the centres of wealth and power. A king who could not capture cities was limited in what he could achieve, forced to bypass strong points that could threaten his communications and limit his freedom of action. Philip's siege capabilities allowed him to reduce enemy cities systematically, eliminating resistance and incorporating conquered territories into his growing empire. The army that Philip built was expensive to maintain. The soldiers required regular pay, the horses needed fodder, the siege engines consumed resources, and the constant campaigns demanded supplies of food, weapons, and equipment. Philip funded this military machine through multiple sources: the gold and silver mines, tribute from conquered peoples, plunder from successful campaigns, and the agricultural wealth of Macedonia itself. The king also proved adept at using his military power to generate more resources. Successful campaigns brought plunder and tribute, which funded further campaigns, which brought more plunder and tribute. This virtuous cycle allowed Philip to expand his army continuously, fielding ever larger forces as his conquests grew. By the end of his reign, he could put tens of thousands of soldiers into the field, a force that dwarfed anything the individual Greek city-states could match. Training remained central to the Macedonian military system throughout Philip's reign. New recruits underwent intensive preparation before being assigned to units, learning the skills they would need to survive and contribute on the battlefield. Experienced soldiers continued to drill regularly, maintaining their edge and incorporating lessons learned from recent campaigns. The army was never allowed to become complacent, never permitted to rest on past victories. Philip demanded absolute obedience from his soldiers, but he also rewarded them generously. Successful warriors received land grants, cash bonuses, and social advancement. The king knew the name of every officer and many of the common soldiers, praising good performance and punishing failure. This personal attention created bonds of loyalty that held the army together through the hardships of campaign after campaign. The Macedonian military system that Philip created would prove its worth repeatedly in the years to come. It would defeat the Illyrians who had humiliated Macedonia for generations. It would crush the Greek city-states that had looked down on Macedonia as a barbarian backwater. It would lay the foundations for Alexander's conquests, carrying Macedonian arms to the ends of the known world. All of this began with Philip's reforms, with his vision of what Macedonia could become and his determination to make that vision reality. Philip's genius extended far beyond the battlefield. He was equally skilled in the arts of diplomacy, using marriages, alliances, bribes, and deception to achieve his goals. Indeed, Philip often preferred to win through negotiation rather than fighting, understanding that diplomatic victories were usually cheaper and more durable than military ones. The king's approach to diplomacy was thoroughly pragmatic. He had no fixed principles beyond the advancement of Macedonian power, no permanent allies or permanent enemies. Every relationship was evaluated based on its usefulness to Macedonia, and relationships that ceased to be useful were discarded without sentiment. This flexibility allowed Philip to adapt to changing circumstances, forming new alliances as old ones became obsolete. Marriage was one of Philip's most important diplomatic tools. In the ancient world, royal marriages created bonds between ruling houses, sealing alliances, and producing heirs who embodied the union of different peoples. Philip pursued this strategy with extraordinary energy, marrying at least 7 women during his reign, each marriage serving a specific political purpose. His first marriage, or at least the first one we know about, was to Phyla, a woman from the ruling house of Elymiotis, one of the highland regions of western Macedonia. This marriage helped secure the loyalty of the Elymiots, binding their ruling family to Philip through ties of kinship. The highland lords had always been semi-independent, acknowledging the Argead kings only when convenient. By marrying into their families, Philip made himself one of them, giving them a stake in his success. Philip's marriage to Ordata, an Illyrian princess, served a similar purpose. After his initial conflicts with the Illyrians, Philip sought to stabilize his western frontier through a marriage alliance. Audata was probably a relative of King Bardalis, and the marriage signalled Philip's willingness to coexist peacefully with his former enemies. The union produced a daughter, Sinan, who would later play her own role in Macedonian history. The marriage to Philina of Larissa connected Philip to Thessaly, the region immediately south of Macedonia. Thessaly was famous for its cavalry and its wealthy aristocratic families, and an alliance with Thessalian nobles could provide both military resources and political support. Philina bore Philip a son Aridaeus, who would eventually become king after Alexander's death, though his mental limitations made him a figurehead rather than a true ruler. Perhaps the most significant of Philip's marriages was to Olympias of Epirus. Epirus was a kingdom to the west of Macedonia, controlling important territory and maintaining connections to the Greek world through its ruling family's claimed descent from Achilles. Olympias was a princess of the Molossian royal house, and her marriage to Philip created an alliance that secured Macedonia's western flank. Olympias would become Philip's principal wife, the mother of his heir Alexander, and a formidable political figure in her own right. She was intelligent, ambitious, and utterly devoted to advancing her son's interests. Her relationship with Philip was passionate but troubled, marked by intense emotions and eventual bitter conflict. We will return to Olympias later, for her story is intertwined with Philip's fate. Philip also married Medea of Thrace, strengthening his position in that important region. The Thracians controlled territory rich in resources, including gold mines that Philip coveted. A marriage alliance helped smooth relations and facilitated Philip's eventual expansion into Thracian lands. Nicosypolis of Pherai was another Thessalian bride, her marriage reflecting Philip's deep involvement in Thessalian affairs. She died shortly after giving birth to a daughter, Thessalonica, who would later give her name to one of the great cities of the ancient world. The last of Philip's known marriages was to Cleopatra, a young Macedonian noblewoman. This marriage, coming late in Philip's reign, would have fateful consequences that we will explore in due course. These marriages were not simply personal unions but strategic investments. Each one brought Philip something he needed, whether territorial security, military resources, or political legitimacy. The children produced by these marriages created a web of dynastic connections that tied various regions and peoples to the Macedonian throne. Beyond marriage, Philip employed a full range of diplomatic techniques. He was famous for his use of bribery, spending lavishly to buy the support of foreign politicians, generals, and officials. The gold from Macedonia's mines flowed outward in a constant stream, corrupting Philip's enemies and creating networks of supporters in cities throughout the Greek world. Philip reportedly said that no fortress was impregnable if a donkey laden with gold could climb to its gates. This cynical observation reflected his understanding that most men had their price, that loyalty could be purchased if the offer was generous enough. He maintained agents in every major Greek city, men who reported on local politics and who worked to advance Macedonian interests through whatever means were necessary. The king was also a master of deception. He made promises he had no intention of keeping, signed treaties he planned to violate, and generally said whatever was necessary to achieve his immediate objectives. This approach earned him a reputation for untrustworthiness among the Greeks, but Philip was unconcerned with his reputation. Results were what mattered, and his methods produced results. Philip's diplomatic strategy often involved playing his enemies against each other. He would support one faction in a city against another, or encourage conflicts between rival states, always positioning Macedonia to benefit from the resulting chaos. When his enemies were fighting among themselves, they could not unite against him. When they were weakened by internal strife, they became easier targets for Macedonian expansion. The king showed remarkable patience in his diplomatic endeavours. He was willing to wait years for the right opportunity, maintaining friendly relations with potential targets while he built his strength and prepared his moves. When he finally struck, his victims often found themselves isolated, their potential allies neutralised by Philip's careful preparatory work. Philip's treatment of defeated enemies varied according to circumstances. Sometimes he was generous, offering favourable terms that encouraged others to submit without fighting. Other times, he was harsh, destroying cities and enslaving populations to send a message about the costs of resistance. The inconsistency was deliberate, keeping his enemies off balance and uncertain about what to expect. The king understood that diplomacy and military force were complementary tools, each making the other more effective. His diplomatic efforts created opportunities for military action, while his military victories strengthened his diplomatic position. A city that might have resisted Macedonian pressure became more cooperative after watching Philip destroy a neighbour. A potential ally became more enthusiastic after seeing the Macedonian army in action. This integrated approach to strategy set Philip apart from most of his contemporaries. The Greek city-states tended to view diplomacy and warfare as separate activities, conducted by different people according to different rules. Philip saw them as aspects of a single enterprise. The advancement of Macedonian power by whatever means proved most effective in any given situation. With his army reformed and his diplomatic position strengthened, Philip was ready to settle accounts with the enemies who had humiliated Macedonia for so long. The Illyrians came first, for they represented the most immediate and dangerous threat to the kingdom's survival. In 358 before the Common Era, approximately 1 year after taking power, Philip led his new army westward to confront King Bardalis. The old Illyrian king was confident of victory. He had defeated the Macedonians repeatedly, killing Philip's brother and thousands of Macedonian soldiers. He had no reason to expect that this young king would prove any more formidable than his predecessors. Bardalis was wrong. The army that Philip brought against him was fundamentally different from the forces the Illyrians had faced before. The Macedonian infantry advanced in tight formation, their sarissas creating an impenetrable wall of iron points. The cavalry, disciplined and coordinated, waited for their moment to strike. The battle was decisive. The Macedonian phalanx held firm against the Illyrian assault, absorbing the enemy's attacks without breaking. Then Philip led his companion cavalry in a devastating charge that shattered the Illyrian formation. The rout that followed was catastrophic for the Illyrians. 7,000 of their warriors fell, including many of their best fighters. King Bardalus himself may have died in the battle, or shortly afterward. This single victory transformed the strategic situation in the Western Balkans. The Illyrian confederation that Bardalus had built collapsed with his defeat, fragmenting into smaller tribal groups that posed no serious threat to Macedonia. Philip recovered all the territory that had been lost to the Illyrians and extended Macedonian control into regions that had never before acknowledged Argead authority. The victory over Bardalus also sent a powerful message to Macedonia's other enemies. The kingdom that had seemed on the verge of extinction just a year earlier had suddenly become a major military power. The Paeonians, Thracians, and Greeks all took notice, reassessing their assumptions about Macedonian weakness. Philip followed up his victory over the Illyrians with campaigns against the Paeonians to the north. These operations were relatively straightforward, as the Paeonians lacked the strength to resist the Macedonian army effectively. Philip defeated them in battle, forced them to accept Macedonian overlordship, and incorporated their territory into his growing realm. The Thracians presented a more complex challenge. Thrace was a vast territory, stretching from Macedonia's eastern border all the way to the Black Sea. It was inhabited by numerous tribes, some powerful and well-organized, others smaller and more fragmented. The region possessed enormous wealth, including gold and silver mines that rivaled those of Macedonia itself. Philip's approach to Thrace combined military pressure with diplomatic manipulation. He launched campaigns against individual Thracian tribes, defeating them and forcing them to accept Macedonian authority. He formed alliances with other tribes, using them against their neighbours. He established Macedonian colonies in strategic locations, creating permanent footholds in Thracian territory. The conquest of Thrace was not a single campaign, but a process that extended over many years. Philip returned to the region repeatedly, each time pushing Macedonian influence further east. He captured important cities, including Crenides, which he refounded as Philippi, naming it after himself. The gold mines near Philippi became a major source of revenue, reportedly producing over 1,000 talents of gold per year. Philip's Thracian campaigns brought him into contact with the Greek cities along the northern Aegean coast. These cities, many of them Athenian colonies or allies, controlled important harbours and trade routes. They also possessed the timber resources that Athens needed for its fleet. Philip's expansion threatened Athenian interests in the region, setting the stage for the long conflict between Macedonia and Athens that would dominate the following decades. The city of Amphipolis was a particular prize. Located at the mouth of the Strymon River, Amphipolis controlled access to the Thracian interior and its rich resources. Athens had founded the city but lost control of it decades earlier, and the Athenians desperately wanted it back. Philip captured Amphipolis in 357, adding its strategic position and economic resources to his growing empire. The fall of Amphipolis marked a turning point in Philip's relationship with Athens. The Athenians had hoped that Philip would return the city to them, perhaps in exchange for support against his other enemies. When Philip kept Amphipolis for himself, Athenian opinion turned sharply against him. The city, that had been willing to make peace now, became an implacable enemy. Philip continued his expansion along the coast, capturing Pydina, Potidaea, and other important cities. He founded new settlements, including Philippi, and reorganized the region's administration to maximize the flow of resources to Macedonia. The gold and silver from the Thracian mines funded his continuing military build-up, allowing him to field ever larger armies. The conquest of the north transformed Macedonia from a regional power into something approaching an empire. Philip now controlled territory stretching from the Adriatic coast to the approaches of the Black Sea, from the Danube frontier to the borders of Thessaly. The resources of this vast realm, its manpower, its minerals, its timber, and its agricultural wealth, all flowed to support Macedonian power. But Philip's ambitions extended beyond the northern territories. His ultimate goal was the conquest of Greece itself, the subjugation of the proud city-states that had looked down on Macedonia for so long. The campaigns in the north were preparation for this greater struggle, building the strength and experience that Philip would need to challenge the Greeks on their own ground. Philip's intervention in Greek affairs began almost accidentally, through his involvement in the sacred wars that convulsed the Greek world in the mid-4th century. These wars, fought over control of the sacred sanctuary at Delphi, provided Philip with the opportunity he needed to insert himself into the heart of Greek politics. Delphi was the most important religious site in the Greek world, home to the oracle of Apollo and the meeting place of the Amphictyonic League, an ancient religious organization that included most of the Greek states. The sanctuary possessed enormous wealth accumulated over centuries of offerings from grateful worshippers. Control of Delphi meant control of this wealth and the prestige that came with guardianship of the sacred site. The Third Sacred War began in 356 when the Phocians, a people of central Greece, seized control of Delphi and used its treasures to hire a large mercenary army. The Phocian leaders, Philomelus and later Onomachus, used this army to resist the other members of the Amphictyonic League who demanded the return of the sacred funds. The war dragged on for years, devastating central Greece and drawing in powers from across the Greek world. Thessaly became involved in the sacred war on the side of the Amphictyonic League, opposing the Phocians. But the Thessalians were divided among themselves, with different factions supporting different policies. Some Thessalian leaders appealed to Philip for help against the Phocians, offering him the opportunity to intervene in a conflict that could reshape the political map of Greece. Philip accepted the invitation eagerly. He led his army south into Thessaly, presenting himself as a champion of Apollo and a defender of the sacred sanctuary. His initial campaigns were not entirely successful. The Phocian general Onomachus defeated Philip twice, forcing him to retreat back to Macedonia. These were the only significant defeats of Philip's career, and they demonstrated that even his reformed army was not invincible. But Philip learned from his failures. He returned to Thessaly with a larger army and better tactics. In 352 he met Onomachus at the Battle of the Crocus Field, one of the most decisive engagements of the ancient world. Philip's army crushed the Phocians, killing Onomachus and 6,000 of his soldiers. The Macedonian king had the Phocian dead cast into the sea as temple robbers, denied proper burial as punishment for their sacrilege. The victory at the Crocus Field established Philip as a major player in Greek affairs. He was elected Archon of Thessaly, giving him control of that region's famous cavalry and its votes in the Amphictyonic League. He had transformed himself from a northern barbarian into a champion of Greek religion, a defender of sacred law against impious violators. Philip attempted to follow up his victory by marching south through Thermopylae, the narrow pass that controlled access to central and southern Greece. But the Athenians and their allies moved quickly to block the pass, denying Philip entry. The Macedonian king, unwilling to risk a costly assault against a fortified position, withdrew northward. He had achieved much, but the conquest of Greece would have to wait. The following years saw Philip consolidate his position in the north, while continuing to meddle in Greek affairs. He intervened in the internal conflicts of various Greek states, supporting factions that favoured Macedonia and undermining those that opposed him. His gold flowed freely, corrupting politicians and buying influence in cities across the Greek world. Athens remained Philip's most determined opponent. The great orator Demosthenes emerged as the leader of the anti-Macedonian faction, delivering a series of speeches known as the Philippics that warned the Athenians of the danger Philip posed. Demosthenes argued that Philip was not content with his northern conquests, but aimed at nothing less than the subjugation of all Greece. The Athenians must resist now, while resistance was still possible, or face enslavement later. Demosthenes was right about Philip's ambitions, but his warnings went largely unheeded. The Athenians were reluctant to bear the costs of sustained warfare, preferring to hope that Philip would be satisfied with what he had already gained. They made half-hearted efforts to oppose Macedonian expansion, never committing the resources needed to stop Philip decisively. The Sacred War finally ended in 346, when Philip negotiated a settlement that gave him everything he wanted. The Phocians surrendered, their cities destroyed, and their people scattered. Philip took their place in the Amphictyonic League, gaining 2 votes that had belonged to Phocis. He also presided over the Pythian Games at Delphi, a signal honour that proclaimed his acceptance as a legitimate member of the Greek community. The Peace of Philocrates, negotiated in the same year, established formal relations between Philip and Athens. The terms were favourable to Macedonia, recognising Philip's conquests and establishing a framework for future relations. Demosthenes and his allies opposed the peace, but they were outvoted by Athenians who preferred accommodation to continued conflict. The peace did not last. Philip continued his expansion, pushing into new territories and threatening Athenian interests. He intervened in the affairs of Euboea, the large island off the Athenian coast, supporting factions hostile to Athens. He besieged cities in the Chersonese, the peninsula that controlled the vital grain routes from the Black Sea. Each new aggression brought fresh protests from Athens, but the protests were not backed by effective action. Philip also expanded his influence in the Peloponnese, the southern peninsula of Greece. He formed alliances with states that resented Spartan dominance, offering them support against their traditional enemy. Sparta had been weakened by decades of conflict and could not effectively resist Macedonian encroachment. Philip's diplomacy isolated the Spartans, surrounding them with hostile neighbours who looked to Macedonia for leadership. The Greek world was being drawn inexorably into Philip's orbit. Some states allied with him willingly, seeing advantages in Macedonian friendship. Others were coerced, forced to accept terms they would have rejected if they had possessed the strength to resist. A few, led by Athens and Thebes, continued to oppose Philip, but their opposition was disorganised and ineffective. By the mid-340s, Philip dominated the Greek world without having conquered it outright. He controlled Thessaly directly, held decisive influence in the Amphictyonic League, and maintained alliances with states across the peninsula. Only a united Greek resistance could stop him, and the Greeks seemed incapable of uniting against any threat. Philip understood that his position, while strong, was not yet secure. The Greeks might eventually overcome their divisions and form the coalition needed to challenge Macedonian power. To prevent this, Philip needed to deliver a decisive blow, a victory so complete that resistance would become impossible. The opportunity for such a blow would come soon at a place called Chaeronea. The crisis that led to Chaeronea began in 340, when Philip besieged the cities of Perinthus and Byzantium, both allies of Athens and both controlling crucial points along the grain route from the Black Sea. The Athenians depended on this grain to feed their population, and Philip's attacks threatened to strangle their city economically. Athens finally responded with determination. The assembly voted for war, and Demosthenes worked to build a coalition against Philip. He travelled to Thebes, Athens's traditional rival, and convinced the Thebans to join the alliance against Macedonia. This was a diplomatic triumph, uniting the two most powerful states of central Greece against the common enemy. The allied army that gathered to oppose Philip was formidable. The Athenians contributed their full levy, including citizens who had never before seen battle. The Thebans brought their famous infantry, including the Sacred Band, the elite force of 300 warriors who had never been defeated in battle. Contingents from other Greek states joined the alliance, creating a force that outnumbered Philip's army. The two armies met at Chaironea in Boeotia in August of 338. The battlefield was a plain flanked by mountains, offering limited room for manoeuvre. The Greeks deployed with the Athenians on the left, the Thebans on the right, and allied contingents in the centre. They anchored their flanks on natural obstacles, creating a strong defensive position. Philip deployed his army with care, placing his best troops at the crucial points. The Macedonian phalanx formed the centre, its sarissas gleaming in the summer sun. On the right wing, Philip himself commanded the veteran infantry. On the left wing, the young Alexander, just 18 years old, led the companion cavalry. This was Alexander's first major battle, and he was eager to prove himself. The battle began with Philip's right wing advancing against the Athenians. The Macedonians pushed forward, engaging the Athenian line, and then falling back in what appeared to be a retreat. The Athenians, many of them inexperienced in warfare, pursued eagerly, breaking their formation as they chased the apparently fleeing enemy. This was exactly what Philip wanted. The Athenian pursuit created a gap in the Greek line, separating them from the allied contingents in the centre. Philip's retreat had been a feint, a tactical deception designed to draw the enemy out of position. On the other wing, Alexander struck. The young prince led the companion cavalry in a thunderous charge against the Theban position. The horsemen crashed into the Greek line, seeking to break through and roll up the enemy formation. Alexander fought in the front rank, demonstrating the personal courage that would later make him legend. The Theban Sacred Band stood firm, refusing to break even as the Macedonian cavalry swirled around them. These were the finest soldiers in Greece, bound by oaths and by love to fight to the death rather than retreat. They formed a circle facing outward and fought until the last man fell. All 300 members of the Sacred Band died at Chaironea, their bodies found lying in ranks where they had stood. The destruction of the Sacred Band was both a military triumph and a symbolic moment of profound significance. These warriors represented the finest traditions of Greek martial excellence, the ideal of courage and loyalty that the city-states held most dear. Their annihilation at Macedonian hands demonstrated that the old order was passing, that a new power had arisen that could defeat even the best that Greece had to offer. Philip himself reportedly wept when he saw the bodies of the Sacred Band, honouring their courage even as he celebrated his victory. He ordered a monument erected over their grave, a stone lion that still stands at Chaironea today, weathered by centuries, but still watching over the bones of those brave men. This gesture of respect was characteristic of Philip, who understood the value of magnanimity in victory. The rest of the Greek army fared little better than the Sacred Band. The Athenians, their pursuit having carried them out of position, found themselves attacked from multiple directions as Philip's infantry wheeled against their exposed flank. The allied contingents in the centre, caught between the advancing Macedonian phalanx and the cavalry that had broken through on the wing, began to crumble. What had been a battle became a rout. The Greek army disintegrated, soldiers throwing away their weapons and fleeing for their lives. The Macedonian cavalry pursued relentlessly, cutting down the fugitives without mercy. 1,000 Athenians died on the field, and 2,000 more were captured. The Theban losses were equally severe. The combined Greek army that had marched to Chaeronea confident of victory had been utterly destroyed. The news of the disaster reached Athens with terrifying speed. Panic gripped the city as citizens imagined Macedonian soldiers marching through their streets, burning their homes and enslaving their families. The assembly met in emergency session, voting desperate measures for the defence of the city. Walls were repaired, weapons were distributed, and slaves were promised freedom if they would fight. Demosthenes himself helped organise the defences, working frantically to prepare for a siege that everyone expected. But Philip did not march on Athens. Instead, he sent the bodies of the Athenian dead home for proper burial, accompanied by his son Alexander and a delegation bearing terms for peace. The terms were remarkably generous. Athens would retain its independence, its fleet, and most of its possessions. The city would become an ally of Macedonia, contributing to Philip's future campaigns, but it would not be occupied or humiliated. Philip's clemency toward Athens was calculated rather than sentimental. He needed the Athenian fleet for his planned invasion of Persia, and he knew that a destroyed Athens would be useless, while a cooperative Athens could be valuable. He also understood that excessive harshness might unite the Greeks against him, undoing the victory he had just won. By treating the defeated Athenians with respect, he encouraged other Greek states to accept Macedonian leadership peacefully. Thebes received harsher treatment, though not as harsh as it might have been. Philip installed a Macedonian garrison in the Theban citadel, the Cadmea, ensuring that the city could not rebel. He dissolved the Boeotian League that Thebes had dominated and freed the cities that had been subject to Theban control. Some Theban leaders were executed, others exiled, and the city's political influence was permanently broken. The other Greek states hastened to make peace with the victor. Embassies arrived at Philip's camp from across the peninsula, offering submission and seeking favourable terms. Most received them. Philip was building a coalition, not conquering an empire, and he needed willing allies rather than resentful subjects. Only Sparta refused to submit. The Spartans had not participated in the Battle of Chaeronea, their depleted strength making them irrelevant to the conflict. But they clung to their pride, refusing to acknowledge Macedonian supremacy, even when they lacked the power to resist it. Philip marched into the Peloponnese, devastating Spartan territory and stripping away the last remnants of Spartan power. But he did not attempt to capture the city itself. Sparta was left isolated and impotent, a monument to past glory surrounded by enemies who owed their freedom to Macedonia. In the winter following Chaeronea, Philip summoned representatives from across Greece to a congress at Corinth. There, he announced the formation of a new organisation, the League of Corinth, that would unite the Greek states under Macedonian leadership. The League was technically a voluntary alliance of free states, but everyone understood that membership was not optional. The Greeks were being offered a choice between willing cooperation and forced submission. The structure of the League of Corinth was carefully designed to preserve the appearance of Greek autonomy while ensuring Macedonian control. Each member state retained its internal independence, governing itself according to its own laws and customs. The League had a council where representatives from all member states could voice their opinions and vote on collective decisions. Wars between member states were prohibited, and a common peace was established throughout Greece. But the real power lay with the hegemon, the leader of the League, and that position belonged to Philip and his successors forever. The hegemon commanded the League's military forces, directed its foreign policy, and could intervene in the internal affairs of member states to maintain order. Philip had created a framework that gave him control over Greece while allowing the Greeks to pretend they were still free. The League's first major decision was to declare war on Persia. Philip presented this as a war of revenge for the Persian invasions of Greece a century and a half earlier, when Xerxes had burned Athens and threatened to enslave all the Greeks. The Greeks would now repay that ancient wrong, carrying the war to Persian soil and liberating the Greek cities of Asia Minor from barbarian rule. This appeal to Greek patriotism and historical grievance was shrewd propaganda. It gave the Greeks a cause they could embrace enthusiastically, transforming them from conquered subjects into partners in a glorious enterprise. It also provided a justification for the Macedonian military presence in Greece, since the League's forces needed to remain mobilized for the coming campaign. Philip had found a way to maintain his control while channeling Greek energy toward external conquest rather than internal resistance. The Congress at Corinth marked the completion of Philip's conquest of Greece. In less than 20 years, he had transformed Macedonia from a weak, divided kingdom into the dominant power of the Greek world. He had defeated every enemy who opposed him, from the Illyrians in the west to the Athenians in the south. He had built the finest army in the ancient world and used it to establish a hegemony that none could challenge. But Philip's greatest ambition remained unfulfilled. The invasion of Persia, the campaign that would crown his achievements and establish Macedonia as a world power, still lay in the future. Philip began preparations immediately, sending an advance force across the Hellespont to secure a bridgehead in Asia Minor. The main army would follow in the spring, led by the king himself. Philip never made that crossing. Before he could lead his army into Asia, he would fall victim to an assassin's blade, struck down at the moment of his greatest triumph. The Persian campaign would be left to his son Alexander, who would carry Macedonian arms to the ends of the earth and earn the title that history would remember, Alexander the Great. The court of Philip at Pella was a place of splendour and danger, where ambition and jealousy simmered beneath a surface of royal magnificence. To understand Philip's fate, we must explore the complex web of relationships that surrounded him, the wives and children, the friends and rivals, whose competing interests would ultimately lead to tragedy. At the centre of this web stood Olympias, Philip's most important wife and the mother of his heir, Alexander. Olympias was a woman of fierce intelligence and fiercer passions, devoted to her son with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She came from Epirus, the kingdom to the west of Macedonia, and she never let anyone forget her royal blood and her connection to the hero Achilles. The marriage between Philip and Olympias had begun with passion, but deteriorated over the years into mutual hostility. Philip's numerous other marriages, each undertaken for political purposes, wounded Olympias's pride and threatened her position. She was technically the principal wife, the queen whose son would inherit the throne, but Philip's other wives had their own ambitions for their own children. Olympias was deeply religious, devoted to the ecstatic cults of Dionysus and to mysterious rites that many found disturbing. Ancient sources describe her handling sacred snakes during religious ceremonies, allowing the creatures to twine around her body in ways that shocked conventional observers. Whether these stories are literally true or exaggerated by hostile writers, they suggest that Olympias was a woman who defied ordinary expectations and conventions. The relationship between Olympias and Philip became increasingly strained as Alexander grew older. Olympias filled her son's head with stories of his divine destiny, encouraging him to see himself as something more than merely human. She emphasized his descent from Achilles through her family and hinted that his true father might be not Philip but a god. These suggestions infuriated Philip, who saw them as attempts to undermine his authority and alienate his son. Alexander himself was a remarkable young man, combining physical courage with intellectual brilliance. Philip had provided him with the finest education available, hiring the philosopher Aristotle to serve as his tutor. For 3 years, Alexander studied with one of the greatest minds in human history, learning philosophy, science, literature, and the arts of rhetoric and reasoning. But Alexander was more than a scholar. He was also a warrior, trained from childhood in the Macedonian military tradition. He could ride any horse, wield any weapon, and lead men in battle with a natural authority that inspired absolute devotion. At Chaeronea, commanding the companion cavalry, at just 18 years old, he had proven himself worthy of his father's legacy. The relationship between Philip and Alexander was complicated. Philip clearly loved his son and took pride in his achievements. He groomed Alexander as his successor, giving him important commands and responsibilities. But there was also tension between them, a competitive edge that sometimes flared into open conflict. One famous story illustrates this tension. When Philip's army captured a particularly fine horse named Bucephalus, no one could ride the spirited animal. Alexander, still a boy, observed that the horse was afraid of its own shadow. He turned Bucephalus toward the sun, eliminating the shadow, and mounted successfully. Philip reportedly wept with pride and told his son that he would need to find a kingdom worthy of him, for Macedonia was too small. The story may be embellished, but it captures something true about the relationship. Philip recognized that Alexander was exceptional, perhaps even more talented than himself. This recognition brought pride but also unease. What father does not feel complicated emotions when his son threatens to surpass him? The court was filled with other figures whose ambitions intersected with those of the royal family. Parmenion was Philip's most trusted general, a veteran commander who had served the king loyally for decades. He led the advance force that Philip sent to Asia Minor, preparing the way for the main invasion. His sons held important positions in the army, and his family's fortunes were tied closely to the Macedonian throne. Antipater was another senior figure, a skilled diplomat and administrator who would later serve as regent of Macedonia during Alexander's campaigns. Attalus was a rising noble whose family was gaining influence at court. These men and others formed factions that competed for royal favour, their rivalries adding to the dangerous atmosphere of the palace. The crisis that would destroy Philip began with a marriage. In 337, Philip took a new wife, a young Macedonian noblewoman named Cleopatra. This was not unusual in itself, as Philip had married many times before. But this marriage was different. Cleopatra was a full-blooded Macedonian, unlike Olympias, who was Epirote, and any sons she bore would have a stronger claim to legitimacy in the eyes of traditional Macedonians. Olympias was furious. She saw the marriage as a direct threat to Alexander's position as heir. If Cleopatra produced a son, that boy might displace Alexander in Philip's affections and in the succession. Everything Olympias had worked for, everything she had endured, would be for nothing. The wedding feast became the occasion for a public rupture. Attalus, Cleopatra's uncle, proposed a toast calling for the birth of a legitimate heir to the Macedonian throne. The implication was clear and insulting, that Alexander, son of the foreign Olympias, was somehow less legitimate than a child of the Macedonian Cleopatra would be. Alexander responded with fury, hurling his cup at Attalus and demanding to know if he was being called a bastard. Philip, drunk and enraged, drew his sword and lunged at his own son. But the king stumbled and fell, too intoxicated to keep his feet. Alexander looked down at his father with contempt and reportedly said something like, "Here is a man who wants to cross from Europe to Asia, and he cannot even cross from one couch to another." The aftermath of this confrontation was severe. Alexander and Olympias fled Macedonia, she returning to her native Epirus, and he taking refuge among the Illyrians. Philip had effectively driven away his heir and his principal wife, creating a succession crisis at the worst possible moment. Friends eventually mediated a reconciliation, and Alexander returned to Pella. But the breach had not truly healed. The trust between father and son had been damaged, and Olympias remained in exile, nursing her grievances and perhaps plotting revenge. Philip tried to repair the situation through another marriage, this time offering his daughter Cleopatra, Alexander's full sister, to the king of Epirus. This king was Olympias's brother, also named Alexander, and the marriage would bind Epirus more closely to Macedonia, while perhaps reconciling Olympias to her husband's other marriages. The wedding was set for the summer of 336 to be celebrated at the ancient capital of Aegae with magnificent games and festivities. Representatives from across the Greek world would attend, witnessing the power and splendour of the Macedonian court. Philip intended the occasion to demonstrate his mastery of Greece and to launch his Persian campaign with appropriate ceremony. The stage was set for the final act of Philip's life, a moment of triumph that would become a moment of tragedy. The wedding of his daughter would be the occasion of his death, and the mysteries surrounding that death would never be fully resolved. Philip's planned invasion of Persia was the culmination of his life's work. Everything he had accomplished, the military reforms, the diplomatic manoeuvres, the conquest of Greece, all pointed toward this ultimate objective. The Persian Empire was the greatest power in the known world, stretching from Egypt to India, from the Black Sea to the Arabian desert. To conquer Persia would be to achieve a glory beyond anything any Greek had ever imagined. The strategic logic of the invasion was compelling. Persia was wealthy beyond measure, its treasuries filled with gold and silver, accumulated over centuries of tribute from subject peoples. Capturing this wealth would make Macedonia the richest state in the world, funding further conquests and ensuring Macedonian dominance for generations. Persia was also vulnerable. The empire had been weakened by decades of internal strife, with satraps rebelling against the central authority and royal family members fighting over the succession. The current king, Darius the Third, had come to power through a series of palace intrigues and had not yet established firm control over his vast domains. The Greek cities of Asia Minor, subjects of Persia for 2 centuries, provided a natural objective for the initial campaign. These cities had been founded by Greek colonists and retained their Greek culture despite Persian rule. Liberating them would provide both a propaganda victory and a strategic foothold for further operations. Philip's advance force, commanded by Parmenion and Attalus, had already crossed into Asia Minor and was securing positions for the main army's arrival. The campaign was proceeding according to plan, with several Greek cities welcoming the Macedonians as liberators. Everything was ready for Philip to cross the Hellespont and take personal command. The wedding of Philip's daughter Cleopatra to Alexander of Epirus was scheduled for the summer of 336 at the ancient Macedonian capital of Aegae. This was a deliberate choice of location, connecting Philip's achievements to the traditions of his ancestors. Aegae had been the seat of Macedonian kings for centuries, and its theatre would provide a magnificent setting for the celebrations. Guests arrived from across the Greek world, ambassadors and dignitaries eager to witness the spectacle and to curry favour with the most powerful man in Greece. The festivities lasted for days with feasting, athletic competitions, and artistic performances. Philip spared no expense, determined to display the wealth and power of his kingdom. The second day of the celebrations featured a procession into the theatre, where games would be held in honour of the gods. Philip had arranged for 12 statues of the Olympian gods to be carried in the procession, and alongside them a 13th statue representing Philip himself. This was an audacious statement, placing the mortal king among the immortal gods, claiming a status that Greeks normally reserved for heroes of the distant past. The morning of the procession dawned bright and clear. Philip dressed in white robes, the colour of celebration and triumph. He ordered his bodyguards to keep their distance, wanting to demonstrate that he walked among his people without fear. Beloved by all and threatened by none, this gesture of confidence would cost him his life. The procession entered the theatre to thunderous applause. The crowds had gathered to honour their king, to celebrate the wedding, and to witness the beginning of the great Persian campaign. Philip walked at the centre of the procession, basking in the adulation, perhaps already imagining the greater glories that awaited him in Asia. Then suddenly disaster. A young man broke from the crowd and rushed toward the king. Before anyone could react, he drove a dagger into Philip's chest, piercing his heart. The king fell, dead before he hit the ground. The assassin tried to flee but tripped over a vine root and was caught and killed by the pursuing bodyguards. The assassin was identified as Pausanias, a member of Philip's own bodyguard. He was a young nobleman from the region of Orestis, one of the highland territories of western Macedonia. His motives and the question of whether he acted alone would become the subject of endless speculation and debate. The immediate explanation offered by the sources involves a personal grievance. Pausanias had been a favourite of Philip, perhaps intimately so, as such relationships were common in Macedonian court culture. He had been supplanted in the king's affections by another young man, also named Pausanias. The rejected Pausanias had insulted his rival, calling him shameful names. The rival, shamed by these insults, had sought death in battle, deliberately sacrificing himself in combat. The dead man's friend and patron, a nobleman named Attalus, the same Attalus who had insulted Alexander at Philip's wedding feast, sought revenge for his friend's death. He invited Pausanias to dinner, got him drunk, and then turned him over to his servants and stable hands to be abused. The violation was complete and degrading, leaving Pausanias humiliated and burning for vengeance. Pausanias appealed to Philip for justice, but the king refused to punish Attalus, who was about to depart for Asia Minor with the advance force and who was too important to alienate. Philip tried to compensate Pausanias with gifts and honours, but these gestures only added insult to injury. The young man's grievance festered, growing into a murderous hatred. This explanation, focusing on personal motives, was the official version accepted by most ancient sources. But many observers, both ancient and modern, have suspected that there was more to the assassination than a single disgruntled bodyguard acting alone. Olympias was immediately suspected of involvement. She had the motive, as Philip's death would secure Alexander's succession and end the threat posed by Cleopatra and any children she might bear. She had been in exile, nursing her grievances and perhaps plotting revenge. After Philip's death, she reportedly honoured Pausanias' grave and showed other signs of approval for his deed. Alexander himself fell under suspicion. His relationship with his father had deteriorated badly in the months before the assassination. He had been publicly humiliated at Philip's wedding feast and had fled into exile. Although he had returned and been reconciled with Philip, the wounds had not fully healed. Alexander had the most to gain from his father's death, inheriting the throne and the army and the Persian campaign that would make him immortal. Some sources suggest that Pausanias had consulted with Alexander before the assassination, asking how a man might become famous. Alexander reportedly quoted a line from Euripides about killing the one who wrongs you and those who gave him away in marriage, a reference that could implicate both Philip and Attalus. Whether this story is true or invented after the fact, to cast suspicion on Alexander, we cannot know. The Persians were also suspected of involvement. Darius the Third had every reason to want Philip dead, as the Macedonian invasion threatened his empire. Persian gold had corrupted Greek politicians for generations, and it would have been easy enough to bribe or encourage an assassin. The timing of the assassination, just as Philip was about to launch his campaign, certainly benefited Persia. The truth of who was behind Philip's assassination will probably never be known with certainty. The immediate perpetrator, Pausanias, was killed before he could be questioned. Anyone who might have helped him had every reason to remain silent. The new king, Alexander, had no interest in a thorough investigation that might implicate his mother or himself. What we can say is that Philip's death came at the worst possible moment for his enemies and the best possible moment for his son. Alexander inherited a kingdom at the height of its power, an army ready for conquest, and a war already begun. He would use these advantages to achieve conquests that dwarfed anything Philip had imagined, carrying Macedonian arms to the ends of the earth. Philip was buried at Aegae with royal honours, his body placed in a golden casket and interred in a magnificent tomb. Archaeological excavations in the 20th century uncovered what is believed to be Philip's tomb, containing golden artifacts, weapons, and armour that speak to the wealth and power of the Macedonian king. The bones within the tomb show evidence of the wounds Philip suffered during his lifetime, including the injury that cost him an eye. The man who had transformed Macedonia from a weak, divided kingdom into the dominant power of the Greek world was dead at 46 years old. He had reigned for 23 years, and in that time he had accomplished more than any of his predecessors had achieved in centuries. The army he built, the alliances he forged, and the example he set would shape the history of the ancient world for generations to come. The death of Philip II marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. His son Alexander would go on to conquer the Persian Empire, reaching as far as India before his soldiers refused to march further. Alexander's achievements would earn him the title the Great, a recognition of military genius that has echoed through the centuries. But Alexander's conquests were built on foundations that Philip had laid. The army that conquered Persia was Philip's creation, trained according to his methods and organised according to his principles. The generals who led Alexander's forces, Parmenion, Antipater, Ptolemy, and others, had learned their craft under Philip's command. The wealth that funded the campaigns came from mines that Philip had developed and territories that Philip had conquered. Philip's legacy extended beyond the military sphere. He had created a model of kingship that combined personal leadership with institutional development, showing how a strong ruler could transform a backward kingdom into a major power. His methods of diplomacy, combining marriage alliances, bribery, and strategic deception, would be studied and imitated by rulers for centuries. The League of Corinth that Philip established provided a framework for Greek unity that, despite its limitations, represented a significant political innovation. For the first time, the fractious Greek city-states had been brought together under a single leadership, their energies directed toward external conquest rather than internal warfare. This model would influence later attempts at Greek federation and would provide a template for Roman organisation of the Greek world. Philip's impact on Macedonia itself was transformative. He had taken a kingdom that was weak, divided, and threatened with extinction, and he had made it the most powerful state in the Greek world. He had unified the highland and lowland regions, creating a sense of Macedonian identity that transcended local loyalties. He had developed the kingdom's economic resources, built its administrative capacity, and established its military supremacy. The Macedonian army that Philip created remained the dominant military force in the Mediterranean world for generations. The phalanx tactics he developed, combining the sarissa-armed infantry with coordinated cavalry, would be employed by his successors and would defeat every enemy they faced until the rise of Rome. Even the Romans, when they finally conquered Macedonia, did so only after adapting their own tactics to counter the Macedonian system. Philip's influence on his son Alexander is perhaps his most significant legacy. Alexander inherited not only Philip's kingdom and army, but also his ambition, his courage, and his strategic vision. The invasion of Persia that Alexander completed was Philip's plan, conceived and prepared by the father before being executed by the son. Alexander always acknowledged his debt to Philip, even as he strove to surpass his father's achievements. The relationship between Philip and Alexander remains one of history's great father-son dynamics. Philip built the foundation, Alexander erected the monument. Philip conquered Greece, Alexander conquered the world. Philip created the tools, Alexander wielded them with unprecedented skill. Neither man's achievements can be fully understood without reference to the other. Philip's reputation has suffered somewhat from comparison with his more famous son. Alexander's conquests were so spectacular, his legend so compelling, that Philip has sometimes been reduced to a mere prelude, the warm-up act before the main performance. This is unfair to Philip, whose achievements were remarkable in their own right, and who faced challenges that Alexander never had to overcome. When Philip took power, Macedonia was on the verge of destruction. The army had been shattered, the treasury was empty, enemies pressed in from every direction, and rival claimants threatened civil war. Philip not only survived this crisis, but transformed it into an opportunity, building from almost nothing the greatest military power of the ancient world. Alexander, by contrast, inherited a kingdom at the height of its strength. He had the best army in the world, ample financial resources, and a war already begun. His conquests, however impressive, built upon what Philip had created. Without Philip's reforms, Philip's victories, and Philip's preparations, Alexander's campaigns would have been impossible. The ancient sources recognized Philip's greatness, even as they celebrated Alexander's glory. The historian Theopompus wrote a massive history focused on Philip, treating his reign as the central event of the age. Other writers praised Philip's cunning, his courage, and his political skill. Even Demosthenes, Philip's greatest enemy, acknowledged the Macedonian king's formidable abilities. Philip's character emerges from the sources as complex and multifaceted. He was charming and witty, able to win friends and disarm enemies with his personal magnetism. He was also ruthless and deceptive, willing to break any promise and betray any ally if it served his interests. He was a devoted father who provided Alexander with the finest education available, and he was also a husband whose multiple marriages caused endless conflict and may have contributed to his death. The king's physical courage was legendary. He led his troops from the front, sharing their dangers and hardships. The wounds he accumulated over his career, the lost eye, the broken bones, the maimed leg, testified to his willingness to risk his own life alongside his soldiers. This personal bravery earned him the devotion of his army, a loyalty that survived even the most demanding campaigns. Philip's intellectual abilities were equally impressive. He understood military science at the deepest level, innovating tactics and technologies that revolutionized ancient warfare. He grasped the complexities of diplomacy, manipulating the Greek city-states with a skill that none of his contemporaries could match. He recognized talent in others and knew how to employ it effectively, building a team of generals and administrators who served him with distinction. The question of what Philip might have achieved had he lived longer is one of history's great counterfactuals. He was only 46 when he died, still in his prime, with decades of potential achievement ahead of him. Would he have conquered Persia as Alexander did? Would he have pushed even further into India and beyond? Or would he have consolidated his conquests, building a lasting empire rather than a brief moment of glory? We cannot know the answers to these questions, but we can speculate based on Philip's character and methods. Philip was more cautious than Alexander, more willing to negotiate and compromise, more focused on sustainable gains rather than spectacular adventures. He might have conquered Persia more slowly but more thoroughly, creating administrative structures that could outlast his death. Alexander's empire famously collapsed after his death, fragmenting into warring kingdoms ruled by his generals. Philip might have avoided this fate, building institutions and training successors who could maintain what he had created. But this is speculation, and we must deal with history as it happened rather than as it might have been. Philip's tomb at Aige, discovered in 1977 by the archaeologist Manolis Andronikos, provides a tangible connection to the Macedonian king. The golden artifacts found within the tomb, the weapons, the armour, the ceremonial objects, speak to Philip's wealth and power. The bones themselves, showing evidence of his many wounds, remind us that this was a man who paid a physical price for his achievements. The site of Aige, modern Vagina, has become a place of pilgrimage for those interested in ancient history. Visitors can see the tomb where Philip was buried, examine the artifacts in the museum, and walk the ground where the great king once walked. It is a place where the past feels close, where the achievements of 23 centuries ago seem almost within reach. Philip II of Macedon deserves to be remembered as one of the great figures of ancient history. He transformed a weak kingdom into a world power. He created an army that would conquer an empire. He unified Greece under Macedonian leadership. He prepared the way for his son's unprecedented conquests. And he did all of this through a combination of military genius, diplomatic skill, and personal courage that few have ever matched. The story of Philip is ultimately a story about what one determined individual can accomplish against seemingly impossible odds. When he took power, everything was against him. His kingdom was shattered, his enemies were many, and his resources were few. Through sheer force of will, combined with extraordinary ability, he overcame every obstacle and achieved every goal he set for himself.